and welcome to this show. It's a very interesting session, I hope, for as many people as possible. If you have a child or you teach in school, may I introduce you to Steve Bladon, who recently wrote a blog and is a retired head teacher. He's going to tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. And also to my colleague, Ellie. Ellie Matthews, who is our education consultant, and myself is Lavinia Dowling from the M Word, and my trade background is mental health nursing. Steve and Ellie, thank you both very much for joining me today. Steve, can we come to you, because obviously you wrote a blog and that generated Ellie and I enthusiastically trying to get hold of you. What was your blog? Just very briefly, what was it about?
The blog is called Anxiety School on Fire, and it was written by me from the perspective of a parent of a child, a 12-year-old girl who has been in the last year or year and a half consumed by anxiety. And I've spent much of the last year supporting very closely my daughter, and I began to write about what we were going through, what she was experiencing, and really it just began as me trying to make sense of what was happening to her. And it grew into a blog, and it's a metaphor, really. School on Fire is a metaphor for helping people understand what a child's life can be like when they are consumed with anxiety and anxiety disorder, or other mental health conditions as well.
Lovely, thank you. That's a very powerful piece. As Ellie and I have learned, there's been thousands of people who've read it, and I know you've received a really huge volume of emails. And if that is the case, just for you alone, for your insight, it kind of begs disbelief about what the perception is. One of the things that we were talking about when we met last week was the volume of pupils that affects across the country. And there's been hot off the press. Ellie found that the Social Justice Centre of Social Justice, had printed off the missing link. And there seems a really big number. They're making it sound extremely big number. But actually, is it such a big number, or is it a small percentage? Because I'm kind of really torn by the different statistics that are around. So from an insider's point of view, what do you and Ellie think? What have you experienced? Is anxiety a big problem?
Shall I answer that, or does Ellie want to come to that?
You can both answer.
Okay, so from my perspective, my background is in primary education. The last 12 years, until last year, I was a head teacher of very large primary schools. And what we were noticing as education professionals was, over the last, let's say, 6 years, which predates the pandemic, we were seeing quite a significant increase in the number of young children suffering with mental health issues. And to the point that in 2019, I wrote a different blog about education more generally. And one of the sections in it was about how concerned I was about the growing number of children who were struggling with their mental health, children as young as 4 years old. And that predated the pandemic entirely. And since then, certainly in my last few years of headship, we were seeing quite a rapid rise in the number of children, boys and girls of all ages at primary school, who were battling anxiety, struggling with anxiety disorders. It was affecting their ability to attend school. It was affecting their ability to engage and certainly to thrive. But more than that, it was like shackles for their lives. And we saw parents in turmoil, very distressed children at the gates and at the front door in the morning. And in my last few years in post, we employed a pastoral team that hadn't been in place before. We employed 2 pastoral support assistants to the school. We employed a counselling service direct for our school. We put a huge number of our staff on mental health first aid training, and all of that was in response to what we were seeing in our primary school in recent years. I left my position in January 2023, so I'm a year out of it, but I'm still in touch with many heads and educators, and I know since then that the numbers are growing at an enormous rate. And while my background is primary, my daughter, who's been affected by anxiety, is of secondary age, and certainly the numbers at secondary level are quite astonishing. And there was an article in The Guardian this weekend which was suggesting, I can't remember whether it was 1 in 3 or 3 in 10, they're very similar, but that kind of number of children at secondary age who are, their words, avoiding school due to anxiety.
Yeah, that's very interesting, isn't it?
Possibly a third of the nation's secondary age children, which is mind-blowing.
Mind-blowing. Ellie, what about you? Because you've got children in both primary and secondary. And of course, you, like Steve, have a background in education. What's your kind of viewpoint on this?
I think it's definitely, like Steve says, that number is growing, it's increasing. And I think also these statistics that we've got, or the ones we're aware of, are just part of it, because actually there's those that we know are potentially masking, which don't then fall part of those statistics, or don't then fall part of even the school staff's awareness that those children might be struggling. And therefore, those numbers are going to significantly be potentially higher again, because it's very well known that children with SEN, additional needs, mental health difficulties, lots of those children will put on a mask in brave face. They will fawn through their day and offload at home or shut down at home, even though they have appeared fine through their school day. They then go and missed in those increasing growing numbers. So potentially it's again even higher than what we are hearing about on a day-to-day basis in terms of information or statistics that we hear. I've got children at primary school and I've got children at secondary school. I myself have faced difficulties with my youngest in terms of accessing school based around their SEN needs and also their mental wellbeing needs. This has grown incredibly difficult in terms of where you lie in terms of support. And I think where schools, it's brilliant that they're bringing in these higher pastoral welfare teams, further training, but there still seems to be a real big gap in that really big support to support these children who are struggling. And just linking back into the Centre for Social Justice document from last week, the missing link one, and a couple of the other sort of documents that I read over sort of last week, the Adoption UK one, Steve, I know mentioned the other day, which I've had a glance over too. They all kind of point to the same kinds of themes in terms of having that higher pastoral level, that higher early intervention, increasing training, putting in referrals early. And I know Duncan Baker has recently touched on this in his bill as well, about having sort of more training for teaching staff and having that really early intervention to pick up the children that are struggling on a SEN basis, but equally it links massively into supporting children who have got mental health difficulties.
So there's a couple of points I wanted to pick up on that. And I know from our discussions last week, it would be good to highlight these today. So one of them is the fact that, you know, very, very bluntly, if you cannot get enough staff, enough mental health nurses, enough diagnostic clinicians whether they're mental health nurses, psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, educational psychologists. It really doesn't matter. If you don't have enough staff to support the CAMS service, so that's the children and adult mental health services, how on earth are you going to get those staff into the schools? Because my worry is like when cognitive behavior therapy was rolled out, when we thought about the computer version, receptionists and GP surgeries were expected to kind of support a person coming into the surgery to do that session, and it just wasn't possible. So are we then expecting our pastoral leads to then suddenly be trained as, you know, mental health nurses equivalent, or indeed diagnostics? They're just there isn't the staff number, and there isn't the funding for it anyway. You know, that's the bottom line. But the other thing is as well is for those young people who actually struggle to get into school and make it into school, we highlighted another problem last week, did we not, where you and Steve went to the conference. In fact, Steve spoke there about these children loitering in the corridors and hiding in the toilets, and then having staff having to address those issues. So that again tells us that children are really, really struggling. And if they actually make it into school, those people are not being seen as they might be struggling with their anxiety. Those same young people are being seen as you dawdling, you're not getting into class, you're avoiding being in class, why are you? So I'm really interested to hear both of your perspectives on those. Don't mind who goes first.
Well, in terms of recruiting staff, it's a really crucial point, and I think it's fair to say I've never known a time in education, the whole sector, from early years to post-16 education, recruitment is an enormous challenge. It's very difficult to recruit school leaders. It's difficult to recruit teachers, teaching assistants, wider support staff. And we all know as well from the news and ongoing media reports, there's a teacher recruitment and retention crisis, there's a leadership crisis. And then there's always local factors as well. So if you're in a rural setting, it can be harder to recruit, and so on and so on. I think for me, the issue is more around culture of existing staff. So let's be optimistic and say you have some vacancies, you create a role, you've found some money to pay some people, and you appoint to a pastoral team. I think the crucial matter is what's happening in school has to be whole school. It has to be embedded culturally. It has to be part of the ethos. Everybody has to understand, the lunchtime staff, the teachers, the senior leaders, everybody needs to be on board. Everybody needs to appreciate and respect what's happening with children who are vulnerable due to mental health. And what I sometimes see, and this is partly on social media, which is only ever a snapshot into the full profession, but also from communities I belong to as a parent, quite often there's a divide, because a school might have a really good and strong and effective pastoral team, and they can be doing fabulous, nurturing, supportive work with a child and possibly with their family too.
Yeah.
But sometimes that work is completely at odds with what other school staff are expecting at the very same time, or which senior leaders want. I've experienced that myself. I won't go too much into detail about my experience, but I've got first-hand experience of that. And I've also read some quite ignorant comments on Facebook, sometimes from educators who are criticizing their own pastoral staff, saying things like, if a child's doing this, and I'll paraphrase and say, they're dysregulated. Sometimes I've seen criticism of, well, the pastoral staff just take them off and have a nice time, and they have a little chat, and then I've got to teach them. And there's sometimes a tone around that, and that's a huge issue, because it doesn't work having a couple of people in a school who get a child and who take a very, very compassionate, nurturing approach, and then other staff who are kind of judgmental, less patient, have a different view of what should be happening, to the point that they're quite happy to criticize their own colleagues. And that really, I think, is an enormous issue. And I would say one of the things that schools have to get right, that, you know, the very foundation of this is whole school culture, whole school approach. You can't just have one person being compassionate and another berating the same child. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
And I think, Steve, as well, in terms of, I know you obviously attended the talk last week as well, with Paul Dix. There is several comments about sort of that school app, which I know Lavinia mentioned sort of at the start, about, you know, how it can be difficult for parents in terms of accessing that, having that sort of school app when it's pinging. But there, in terms of, you know, the things that their child might be doing at school that is picking up negative merits in terms of positive, and the well-being side to pupil and parent that causes. But last week, obviously at the talk, I know there were several schools that mentioned in terms of having that app, and I suppose in terms of it building on, like you're saying, that culture, it could be a useful tool in terms of making sure staff are aware of pupils' needs, by sharing that information about a certain pupil's needs, what they might be struggling with, or how best you could support them if you happen to see that pupil. And therefore more staff are then aware of how to approach that pupil, or to keep an eye out, or just check in with them. And likewise, I know one of the other schools who spoke last week sort of said about, they promote that kind of same cultural staff awareness about pupils, in terms of having a 2-minute window. Pick a child, 2 minutes, you know that child really well. Can you let us as staff know a little bit about that child, how we can support them as other staff in school? And 2 minutes in a staff meeting to update other staff in terms of what could you do to support that pupil if you happen to see them, kind of helps to hopefully build that cultural awareness and understanding in the school of that pupil might benefit from this or might benefit from that. Because there's a lot of school staff in a school, and quite often certain needs or difficulties are kept amongst sort of the teacher, maybe senior leadership team, or the Senko, or the welfare. But other staff then are not aware of that pupil and how else they might be able to be supported if you see them. So I suppose there's sort of two sides to that app part, in terms of it having some positives, definitely in terms of sort of promoting that cultural awareness and understanding for staff to build knowledge, or vice versa, having it as that kind of touch base to be aware. Because otherwise there are definitely moments that you can have eyes and be aware of a lot of pupils, but you might not be fully aware of what might best support them if you're passing them in the corridor.
I mean, these apps are quite interesting, aren't they? Because indeed, one of our non-executive directors relayed that when their child was in primary school, the children were being awarded points for the less times they went to the toilet. And somehow the school must have worked with parents, because somehow it was kiboshed, and you know, they just weren't going to pursue doing that, which is a good thing. But how does it get to, you know, how does an app get to doing that? And I am also intrigued by that, you know, because presumably these apps can be fitted to suit what you're looking for in a school, or have I misunderstood completely? You know, is it like a product that you can buy off the shelf from Sainsbury, but they have a slightly different model, you know, in Asda? I'm wanting to understand, why do we have these apps? Because surely it's more about compliance, isn't it? And kind of showing people up, showing young people up.
Yeah, I mean, the technology, the apps and the AI technology are rapidly advancing, and in my, I don't have any experience as a head of using these type of apps. So I can only comment on the things I've been reading about and sort of anecdotal information. I think, like any walk of life, people turn to apps for efficiency, for speed of communication, for automated services. But I think it's part of the problem because, in my view, the government has turned school attendance into a mathematical problem. There's an obsession with numbers and percentages. There's a desire to see numbers go up, and there's a political agenda behind that. And it terrifies me because I think we've lost sight that actually the attendance crisis is a people crisis. And every single person is a human story and a family, and there's a whole complex array of things happening behind that child. And while an app might be good for sending out a message, it can make you feel good if you receive something nice about your child. It can make you feel rubbish if you're informed by an app that your child is in detention the next day. But again, it's distancing the human connection. And it strikes me that whether we're talking about anxiety, depression, any number of mental health conditions, when we've got to the point we're at, which is almost a third of a generation of children, we've got to do things more profoundly different than use apps, because the apps are actually taking away the human connection. And for me, the solution is relationships, voices. It's two-way. It's reciprocal, and that has to be the solution for me. So I'm not, because I've never used apps as a leader, I wouldn't like to dismiss them entirely. But the things I read about that parents receive, they really worry me, and I don't see them as a solution. I don't think they'll make the children who we're talking about better. So I don't think they'll do anything to meet children's needs, and therefore I don't think they'll, on their own, the apps won't help to get children back into school or to take their seat in the classroom if they are back in school.
Yeah. Have you had experience of these, Ellie?
Yes, so my children's secondary school uses one of these apps. Through my children both started at secondary school in September. Through September and October, as a parent, I checked that app every single day to check what the homework was, what they were doing, what merits they were earning, had they got any demerits on there, were there any red marks. It became something that I checked frequently to check in on. Quite soon, though, I realised that quite often these merits that they are rewarding are whole class kind of merits. And, you've brought your English book in, brilliant, you've got a merit. And then it was soon you sort of realise that actually your child is being merited for some of the things that they've gone for as a whole class, but your child wasn't actually part of that, but they've just awarded the whole class. I've got a very close friend's child who actually the parent was sent to detention on the app for that next day. Child A, your child has got a detention. These are the reasons why. There were several children with this child's name at school, and the school had clicked the wrong child's name, being the same first name. This parent then had received a detention for a child that wasn't even theirs, causing the parent huge sort of distress and worry. The child came home not knowing that that was the case because it had been clicked and assigned to the wrong child. The parent then discussed it with the child. The child's going, but I didn't do that. That wasn't me. And when they then obviously raised it with school, they've clicked the wrong child. But the significant distress and upset that things like that have caused parent and pupil. So there definitely are difficulties with apps in terms of things like that. And just linking straight back into Steve, it's definitely that triangle of working together in terms of staff, pupil and parent, and having that pupil's voice is massive in that as well. And you don't get that the same if it's communicating via an app at all. And from reading over various documentation last week, there seems to want to be a massive emphasis on promoting and improving trust and relationships between parents and school staff, especially since COVID, where some parents feel as though relationships between schools are not as strong as they were prior. And the only way to do that is to have all of that working together and have that collaborative approach, which obviously has many, many benefits. And that's where I suppose in person, if face-to-face has massive benefits over the use of an app.
I always struggle with this because it's such a big bone of contention in that parents complain bitterly that they don't get access to communication with staff. It's just a case of your child goes through the gates and that's it, there's nothing. And it's particularly noticeable in secondary school, more so than primary school, but you do notice it with every academic year. There is less and less within primary school. And yet, you know, over decades, I've obviously been working with the National Health Service, and we have bombarded documents with the words or the phrase, you know, working in partnership, working together. Why is this still being talked about when in actual fact, don't do it as lip service, but even hot off the press, the missing links, that has reiterated we need to work in partnership. Well, parents aren't being listened to. So if they're not being listened to, where are we going wrong with that? And the other thing that is a real bone of contention on top of the apps, and it really is a real bone of contention, is how are you going to encourage parents to engage with you if schools take them down the fining routes? Because that's too late. Fining is too late. And yet I know from the volume of parents across social media, they've struggled to get any form of communication through the door to be accepted. And so I'd be really interested to hear your viewpoints on that, Steve, because a lot of parents bitterly complain they cannot get the right people to engage with, and people don't listen to them because they're parents. I mean, there's something really wrong with that. A parent knows their child better than anybody. Why have they not really been listened to?
Well, some big questions there. I mean, I'll answer this firstly from my head teacher point of view, and I will say, I think, you know, I don't want to just come here and criticize schools. I believe in the education system. I've devoted my career to it, and
yeah.
You know, schools come in for a bashing, parents come in for a bashing. There's all sorts of things here to discuss. I think, in a general sense, primary schools, because of the age of the child, generally they have been, you know, nurturing places. Often primary schools say they have an open door policy. You might see the head and the deputy on the gates. If the classroom door opens onto the playground, when you collect your child, there's an opportunity to talk to the class teacher. Certainly when I collect my younger children, that happens. And so I think there are logistical reasons which make it more straightforward at the primary age phase for parents to have regular access and interaction with their class teacher. On saying that, as numbers of children have increased, children who are struggling,
Yeah,
the demands on schools have risen exponentially. So what I mean is the number of parents who request to speak to a teacher, or the number of parents who would like an appointment with the head teacher or the Senko. And, you know, just from my experience, 12 years of headship, what headship looked like in 2011 when I started and what it looked like in 2023, it was almost another job.
yeah.
You know, I might have had an appointment or two in a week. in 2011 with parents, maybe about a child who was having difficulties, maybe in relation to SEND, or it might have been a safeguarding issue, behavioural, but maybe 1 or 2 appointments a week. And as a head, I took pride in the fact that I would be involved in those scenarios. I would have the conversations, I would invest in them. By the time I left headship, I could have just devoted all day, every day to the requests for meetings, conversations, or in time with dysregulated pupils, and caring for them and consoling them and trying to support them. And that wasn't just me, that was my leadership team. And similarly, my deputy, my Senko, the vast majority of our time was, and this isn't a complaint, it's what was necessary, but it was devoted to children who had some difficulties in engaging with education, or in to do with their well-being. Similarly, class teachers were increasingly being asked to phone parents up or receiving emails to respond to concerns. And we were finding that if a reply wasn't prompt, another email would come, and another email after that. And I understand that as a parent, because I've been there. But the difficulty is, if your full-time job is to teach a class of 30 children in a primary setting, and you're doing that 90% of the week, apart from when you've got, your half a day of PPA time, when do you have those conversations? And it's a practical question. It's not saying those conversations aren't important. It's not saying that the teacher doesn't care. But if you've got a list of 10 people to phone or 20 emails, there's an enormous commitment there around time. It can't be when you're teaching. So, when you're probably on break duty in a primary school, you probably snatch a little bit of time at lunch for your lunch break, but it won't be much. So these calls generally after school. And again, what we were finding was, and mine was a fairly average primary school, teachers were spending a lot of their time every day trying to support by having phone calls, meetings with parents, making sure parents were kept up to speed. But the truth is, it's very difficult. Even if you're in a very inclusive, supportive, nurturing setting, and you're just trying to keep on top of all the different situations affecting all the different children in your care, the problem now is we're talking about huge numbers. And if you think about secondary schools, and we're talking perhaps about a third of all children. So some of them might not be in school, some of them might be in school, but they might be internally truanting. Some of them might be presenting with challenging behavior. Some of them might be disengaged. The demands there on that school, every child, if you were to have all the conversations that you would ideally have, as well as all the internal conversations you need to have as a school, and all the record keeping you need to do, the demands on time are simply astronomical. And I'm not making excuses, because in lots of instances things aren't good enough, but we've reached a point where we're talking about so many children now, which is why it has to be that we look more broadly at the education system, because we can't just suddenly find an extra 5 hours in a school day to improve our communication with families or to address everything that happens that day. It's really complex.
Ellie?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I agree completely with all of that, having been in the education building myself. It is incredibly stretched. And I know even from incidents that might have happened at playtime, down from first aid to sort of more dysregulated pupils, any of those sometimes warrant a phone call sooner rather than later. That then sometimes finds itself landing on the TA and support staff to then go and make these phone calls after break time. You then run the risk of, if those parents don't answer the telephone, they then call back later. If an incident has involved 2 or 3 pupils, you've then tried to chase 2 or 3 pupils after playtime on the telephone. You can't get through to the parents. You go back to class, having that classroom, those pupils and the teacher having lost out on their TA and their support for that 15, 20 minutes that you've been trying to reach parents. You then get a message from the office that says, oh, blah, blah's parents now on the phone. So you either have to say, sorry, I'll have to call back later, or once again, your support staff, your TAs, are used out of the classroom, impacting your pupils and your teachers, to go and make these phone calls to update parents. So it is a really difficult situation, from heads all the way down to the teaching staff, all the way down to the TAs, who are trying to communicate with those parents at all possible moments during the day, to inform them of things that have happened that might not be something that's been able to wait until the end of the day. And that has a knock-on effect for the staff and pupils in school in terms of the time that you're out of the class making those phone calls. It also, I suppose, has impacts in terms of parents who have missed phone calls from school and then thinking, eek, school's rang, or they've been called away from their job to come and take a phone call from school to be informed of something. So that's difficult on both ways. And as a parent and working in school, I've been on both grounds of that as well. It's challenging, I think, as a parent to sometimes get the chance or opportunity to speak to school staff, but I know that they prioritise fitting that in. But likewise, that comes as after school or during lunch times, which again, school staff have certain amount of directed time, and time is incredibly difficult. If you've got 30 children in a class, even if every parent wanted to catch you for 2 minutes at the end of the day to chase a reading book or to ask if there was a newsletter or whatever it might be, you've added an additional hour instantly just doing those kinds of things. I know from my children's primary school, they recently, I think it was summer term, bought in it used to be that you could email the teaching staff at any point that you needed to. They changed, it had been that rule for sort of 5 or 6 years. They changed this back in the summer term to kind of go through, every email now has to go through the admin in the office. And it will then be filtered to the teacher unless school office staff can answer it. They had shared quite a bit of sort of information about, actually, you know, sometimes you're getting, what days my class is PE or what's forest school, and therefore actually teachers are having to spend time responding to things that actually admin staff could be responding to, rather than it taking up teachers' time. One of the lovely things that my children's primary school did in reception, and I think this is where you do, as they get older, lose that contact with school staff slightly. But in reception, they had a one-way system. I suppose logistically, the way their classrooms worked, it was feasible to do so. You walked into the reception building and you walked into one of the 3 classrooms that your children were in, and then they had a door that went out to their EYFS area. So the TA was stood on the first door, teacher was stood on the second door. So sometimes you obviously didn't need to speak to them, but you also got updates from TA or teacher or both, even with, this is what we've done today, or come and have a quick walk around our classroom. So you had that really positive communication and depth of being involved with them. You knew what was going on in that classroom, and you had the opportunity to speak to both members of staff if you needed to. That was lovely. We had quite a stop to that when COVID happened, and obviously then parents weren't allowed in the building. And I think potentially that is definitely going to have had an impact in terms of parents' evenings are often being online or via the telephone, and therefore you've lost that personal face-to-face touch again. Things like coming to look at your children's artwork in the hall doesn't happen as often as I think it did pre-COVID, or open the book, come and look around your children's work afternoon. These events, I think, have slowly fallen off. But equally, I suppose teachers' time and demands have gone up as well, and the whole school have, and therefore fitting these events in on top of everything else they're time restricted to do is incredibly difficult too.
Okay, so you're both kind of, I mean, you've really helped me understand that it's not just a very simplistic situation here. There is an awful lot going on in the school day and taking up so much time. And like you say, Ellie, things are being lost. Okay, so what about the fines then? If we're trying to work in partnership with our parents, what about that? Because I know a lot of parents will want to hear the answer. You know, that's not helping, surely, partnership working.
No, I mean, the penalty notice and the prosecution and the legal system are, and they've been totally misinterpreted in my view, and
Right.
they are often now being used as a mechanism for addressing, in inverted commas, children's persistent absenteeism. Now, the guidance from the Department for Education is actually very clear, and this is guidance for schools. Penalty notices are only intended as a sanction, a consequence, when families are failing to engage with a school, and when there is flagrant disregard for all matters relating to attendance. And penalty notices should only be applied by a local authority when it can be shown that doing so would change the parents' behaviour and lead to improved attendance. So
Right.
I will say here, and I don't mind saying this, as a head teacher, I have requested penalty notices from a local authority when I have felt it was my duty to do so, and when it was in line with guidance and local authority policy. It has never ever been for a child who was struggling to attend school due to mental health issues or due to matters relating to an additional need. It has 100% only ever been when families have taken holidays in term time, and they've done that primarily because it's cheaper. And again, I'm not expressing any view here. I was doing my job as a head teacher. If I hadn't done it, I would have been in trouble. But yeah, in that instance, there's a reason why there can be a penalty notice, because the child should be in school, and there's been a decision to take a child out of school in term time, and it becomes unauthorized, and then because of that, there's a penalty notice. That is now being applied to many, many children who are struggling to attend school for reasons of mental health. And it's completely perverse. It's unethical, in my view, as an educator and as a parent. It's a misinterpretation of the guidance. It punishes families. It destroys any trust in places where often trust is lacking. And worst of all, it doesn't help anybody, because it doesn't address the child's needs, and it doesn't resolve the issues that they're facing. It also doesn't incur any money for the school, because if a school applies for a penalty notice, there's tremendous paperwork involved for every single one, and the money doesn't go to the school. So it's a really bizarre situation that we've ended up with many schools and local authorities, almost by default, unauthorizing absences, and then when the unauthorized absences hit a particular trigger, that can result in a penalty notice, and in the worst cases, prosecution and even potentially prison. Now, this comes back to the school's culture and their approach to what's happening. And then it comes back to the coding of the absences. Because again, the guidance from the DfE to schools is very clear. Absences for issues relating to health should be authorised. Those are the DfE's words to schools. They should only, and it states mental health and physical health.
Really? Because a lot of parents are saying that schools are saying mental health is disregarded and it's not authorised.
So there's a document called Working Together to Improve School Attendance. It's a guidance document at the moment. It's due to become statutory in September. But the guidance very clearly says that absences relating to health issues should be authorised in normal circumstances. The only time it shouldn't be authorised is if the school, and ultimately this means the head teacher, believes that there is reason to doubt the validity, really, and I'm paraphrasing here because I don't have the document in front of me, but if there's some reason to doubt the authenticity of the illness, the severity of it, then the school can decide not to authorise that absence. But this is the crux of the whole discussion around penalty notices, because my view is if a child is struggling with their mental health, and that might be resulting in physical health symptoms, or it might not, but it should be enough. The school should be accepting that as a valid reason for a child being absent from school. But what we're finding is some schools accept it as policy, some schools don't accept it as policy. And then there's all sorts of strange variations of this. So some schools and local authorities are actually saying to parents, you can have up to this many days authorised, and after that, we're not authorising anymore, which, you know, it's completely illogical. It's like saying to somebody, you know, you can have this many days for chemotherapy, but if you still need chemotherapy after this many days, we're not authorising it. And it's illogical. As I say, I believe it's unethical. It's a misinterpretation of the guidance, and it doesn't help anyone. It simply adds pressure to parents who are desperately feeling that they've got to simply get their child into school rather than help their child to get better.
So from my perspective, a lot of parents state that they have been advised by their schools that the only way they're going to get anything authorised is if they can show a letter from either the GP or CAMHS. Now, obviously, trying to get an appointment with CAMHS is just, you're going to be waiting months. It's not going to happen quickly. And a lot of GPs are very reluctant to be dragged into this argument because they don't see the young people from day to day, and therefore do not feel that they can give, yes, I'm going to sign this child off, when in actual fact they haven't got the time to liaise with schools to say what's going on and then to liaise with the family. So what would you advise then in those matters? Because I know that families sometimes come to me in desperation saying, we need somebody who's at least got some official capacity to say my child is struggling, and it feeds back into this, we're not being believed, doesn't it? Thank you both so very, very much. I'm very grateful to you. Today, if you came in late to this, I've been joined by guest Steve Bladon and Ellie Matthews, and I'm very grateful to you both. We will be revisiting certain aspects with a couple of other hopeful online podcasts as well as online video, which will be uploaded to our YouTube channel.